Yo, how's everyone been? This weekend, actually lost. I went to Canjam Hong Kong. To be honest, there wasn't many exhibitors, and most of them were about portable, IEM, steps, etc. So since there wasn't a ton to cover, it's a good chance to make a rapid-fire review. The first room was a speaker setup co-hosted by Room and Vivid. They had a G4 and Amp Ultra here. I was pretty surprised, this tiny, well, maybe not so tiny, but anyway, this box is basically a streamer, deck and amp all in one. Think about it, I've got a bunch of big heavy gear at home just to drive my German 15 Edge, so yeah, the level of integration here is pretty impressive, and the bass performance is pretty solid. You get that kind of speaker style bass pressure, that sense of air being moved, but I do think there's still some room for improvement in terms of detail retrieval and microdynamics. The first booth into the main hall is the Campfire audio. Alien brand is something I've been curious for a long time, mainly because it just looks completely unhinged. I definitely wouldn't say it's pretty, but definitely something wild. Sound-wise though, it's nowhere near as wide as it looks. The bass is actually pretty good. It has a solid impact and a nice sense of rumble and weight. Overall, it leans more toward the lower mids and bass. Works well for pop. Then there's the Iris. First listen immediately reminded me of the Ethos. I bought it when I first got into the hobby. Very similar kind of presentation. Then the Trifecta Crimson. Its soundstage presentation is quite unusual. It actually reminds me a lot of the Empire Ear Author. It has one of those tuning where you either love it or just take it off after the first listen. Odyssey Maxwell. As a gaming headset, build quality is honestly excellent. Almost all the chassis is made of aluminum. Even the headband uses spring steel, which is really impressive. But the weight is also pretty wild at 490 grams. Sound-wise, it follows a very similar approach to the ROG Kithara, very straightforward and planned tuning. Clearly tuned with a focus on gaming cues rather than anything. CRBN2, very impressive. Even off something like the 400S, it already sounds very convincing. Hard to imagine how good it would be on my Thieaudio. The background is extremely clean, very much in line with that classic electrostatic type. Clear and pure sounding. At the same time, microdynamics are surprisingly sharp and responsive. It really showcases what stats do best. And on top of that, the bass is actually quite solid for an electrostatic. Then over to Dunu, the DN242 and DN142. Honestly, the show was a bit noisy, so I can't really judge how's the resolution, but both of them have really solid bass texture. You get strong sub-bass rumble with good impact and extension to back it up. From what I can tell, the 242 basically feels like a better extended version of 142 in terms of treble, better treble extension and a more open, airy presentation. Then the Mortis. The AirPods design looks really unusual. At first glance, you'd think it's super uncomfortable, but once you actually put it on, it's surprisingly comfortable. The pads are very soft, and the clamp force is just right. Overall, really easy to wear, really comfortable. I was listening to it through my friend's D250, and the sound gave me this feeling of being in a very small live house. The stage isn't big, but vocal and overall presentation feels solid and grounded. There's the kind of intimate, refined character to it. Overall, good. Alpha 3, a flat head from Dunu. I think the design is actually pretty well done. Aluminum shell with a matte finish feels really good. If you told me this was a tail curtain, I'd definitely believe you. Regarding the sound, the bass and mids feels a bit unfortunate. Then over at Muscobo, running DX6000 of the 485, the bass is actually very impressive. Super full and punchy with a strong sense of rumble, and on top of that, impact is excellent. You can literally put your hand on the cup and feel the whole headphone vibrating. But when it comes to the upper mids and treble, there's a very, final style coloration. You either really like it or really hate it, just like the Trifecta. Fatfreq. They have so many Maestro models that I actually had to stop and think for a second which one I was listening to while writing it. First up was the Thieaudio collaboration Grand Maestro Anniversary. I actually like the original GMA FE more, especially considering that the latter is only about half that price. Only? To me, the gold GMA feels like a more engaging GMA, more bass rumble, stronger impact, and a thicker imaging weight. Then there's the Quantum. My ears are usually pretty adaptable. I can wear most IEMs without any issues, but this one was one of the very few that I actually find a bit uncomfortable. Sound-wise, it's actually very interesting. The vocal and treble presentation has a very unique sense of space. Background feels almost completely black, like everything unnecessary has been absorbed so that the vocal is extremely clean. At the same time, treble extends well without being overly sharp. The downside is that it feels like the tuning has sacrificed some of the bass performance. Last one was the Maestro Mini. Their marketing says it brings together all the Maestro characters at the cheapest price, and honestly, I think it does exactly do that. The tuning feels very much in line with the series. You get that signature Maestro bass. It's quite similar to the Quantum, but with improved bass impact. The mids and treble aren't as distinctive, but the overall character is very consistent. Basically, it's like a Quantum with the bass properly filled in. This one is actually my favorite out of the bunch, and funnily enough, it's also the cheapest one. I think this is kind of cheap that doesn't feel compromised. If anything, it feels like the one that has been tuned with the most care. In a time where IEM pricing sometimes feel completely insane, bring together all the techs at cheapest price is something that I definitely appreciate. Then the iSlab. The strongest impression I have is two things. First, I really like the Spectromnia, and second, the guy there, who is basically the engineer, exhibitor, and probably the owner, is just an amazing person. You can really tell he genuinely loves hi-fi and loves IEMs. When I first listened to the Spectromnia with the stock Mica cable, my reaction was, it's decent, not something that blew me away. But the main issue with the stock setup is that it sounds a little bit too safe, and he clearly picked out on that. Then without hesitation, he walked over to a Flash acoustic booth, grabbed a Thanos cable, and plugged it in. I tried it again. Instantly, the sound became more lively and energetic. He told me that after selling quite a few units, he noticed that listeners in different countries have very different preferences and tastes. Some do prefer a more neutral presentation, but in Asia, it's something the opposite. People lean more towards expressive, more emotional, and sometimes even colored tuning. And honestly, I completely agree with his takes. You can tell he actually thinks deep about tuning. He's not just throwing something together when making an IEM. He's clearly trying to understand what makes a good sound and keep pushing toward that. And for that reason alone, I think iSlab deserves a lot of respect. Then there's the Thieaudio full lineup, which you can barely even find in China. Honestly, I was a bit nervous when listening to them at the booth because I'm probably the only person on YouTube who gave the Headphone Mark II a negative review. To be fair, it doesn't sound that bad, but to me, I'm mainly disappointed at the approach. They tuned the fun, engaging set into a more corrected and neutral one just because it's the mainstream. The Monarch 4 at the show had an issue. The right unit clearly had a tweeter malfunction, so I just skipped that one. I did get to listen to the Monarch 3, Origin and Prestige Limited, and with Thieaudio, you can definitely hear a very clear house sound. Their bass is always full and powerful. The note size is big, impact is deep and heavy, very meaty, very strong slam, just booming. As a bass head, I actually kind of enjoy it. On top of that, both the Monarch 3 and Origin leans towards a more V-shaped tuning, strong bass and very elevated, bright treble. So for things like EDM, they can sound pretty exciting. The Prestige feels a bit more polite. It's less aggressive overall. Treble is toned down in both energy and extension, and the bass impact is also pulled back a bit. So it's not that centered to a EDM, but more versatile across different genres. Between the three, I personally prefer the Origin. Oh, by the way, the Prestige faceplate looks really cool. It has that kind of eclipse-like effect. Torino Spirit Valkyrie. Oh, this thing is 12,000 euro. Thieaudio E1000. One of the most expensive single dynamic driver IEMs, priced at $3,799 US. After listening, honestly, didn't really blow me away. As a single DD, the coherence and natural transitions are definitely there. That part is very good, but at the same time, the usual trade-offs are pretty obvious. Slightly thinner mid-range density and limitations in overall technicalities. In terms of pure technicalities, I'd say it's approximately on par with the multi-driver IEMs around $1,000 US range. So it really comes down to a trade-off, naturalness versus other thing. Treble has good energy and not overly sharp. There was also a U1000 at the booth, which cost about twice as much. Density is improved, but honestly, the difference isn't, let's say, that much. Definitely not enough to justify the price gap, considering this one is nearly $8,000 US. And also considering that there's also other single DD competitors like the Ventura or the HS2000 Mark III. Oops, I should probably probably stop here before I upset anyone. Again, all of this is just my personal opinion, and I've always been someone who prefers to say the thing as they are rather than trying to hype everything up. Or you could just say I'm a bit too blunt. Anyway, your mileage may vary. That's it. Thanks for watching.